to create, quilt and make with Kate. I've decided to use up some of my scraps today and make a bag, like a shopping bag sort of thing. So I'm cutting things into strips and I'm going to show you what I'm up to. Hope you enjoy it. So these are the fabrics that I've cut already. They're actually fabric scraps from clothing that I've made mostly. There's a couple of other things in here. This one's a poplin, but most of the others are either linen or linen blend. So I'm cutting them into 1.5 inch strips, and the scratching you can hear in the background there is my cat. I'll show you. She's sleeping on a cardboard box on my desk. Lola. So that's Lola the cat. Okay, I'm going to sew these together, right sides together, with a strip of roughly the same length in a random fashion. And I don't think the poplin and the linen don't want to sit together. And I'm using 1/4 inch seams. So I'm using the seam guide on my plate here and the edge of my foot basically. So I've sewn a few of these into 2 little pairs, and I'm just going to press them open. Okay, so I've sewn some into 4 strips now. I'm just going to press those as well. You can see here how this edge here is a little bit longer, so I'm actually just going to snip that off for now. And then when I find a shorter one later, I can stitch that to a 2. One's similar in length. I'm going to stitch these as a 4 now. You can see this small piece here got cut off the end of one of those because the other pieces were a different length. But now this one can be sewn onto here and make that little strip. And this one here has become a 6. And then this one here obviously is a 4. And basic maths, of course, I'm going to sew 2 pieces onto it to make it a 6. And the only rule I'm following is not putting the same pieces next to each other. When I start going the other direction, there'll probably be some that fall that way. But now those ones can be sewn together as a 4 and a 2 to become a 6. And we'll keep going. And it's much quicker than dealing with a whole lot of little squares. So I've been sewing like crazy for about less than an hour, probably no more than an hour. And this is what I've come up with. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then I have all of these little blocks that I've made. And these are all scraps. And because I've individually selected these scraps as items to make clothing from, of course they're colours that I love. And generally people choose colours to wear that suit them, and so they sort of go together. Oh, that one's only a 2. I have to fix that one. Well, that one's a 4. Thought they were. Anyway, so there's 6s. That's a 6. That's a little 6. That's a little 6. They're all slightly different. That's a little 6 and a 6 and a 6 and a 6. And all I'm left over with is these ones here that were not needed or too small. And this one here, I didn't have a long enough piece for the top, so I've actually used 2 pieces on that section there, but I can cut them down the middle and still cut my strips out of them. So I'll iron that one in a minute and fix it. And then these ones here, I'll sew that one on there. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll put one of these on here. And that one can go on there too. So that one will complete that one. And then I've got 4 on that one, and I'll see what happens along the way. Maybe I can find something to fit on those ones as well. So out of all those scraps, I think that's a pretty good result. All right, I'll come back in a minute and show you the cutting. Let me just finish sewing these last ones, pressing that one, and then we'll cut the other direction. Okay, so now it's time to cut. So if you haven't already invested in a rotary cutter and a cutting mat, do so. I bought the Alpha brand cutter, and I had a green cutting mat and it didn't work at all, and I didn't actually use it for a couple of years. Finally, I invested in the pink Alpha mat that goes with it, and now I use my rotary cutter all the time. What I'm going to do here is use one of my quilting squares. So it's good to have a few different ones of these, different sizes. I've got 3 or 4 of them, including a big one. And what I'm going to do first is just trim up the edge to make it a square starting point. And then I'm going to turn it around, and because all the strips I started with at the beginning were all 1.5 inches, I'm going to use the guide on my ruler at 1.5 inches, and I'm going to cut the strips this way at 1.5 inches. And that means, despite the fact that they look a little bit rectangular now, when I sew this side and that side, it will bring the squareness back into them. And so I'm just going to cut all of these strips now at 1.5. Now, I don't know if you remember the one that I did with 2 bits at the top here, so this bit here is no use to me. So I'm going to retrim the edge here, making sure that it's straight. And I'm using the lines on the ruler, not on the mat. So that one there with its funny end piece is not so useful for me. So for now, it's going to go in the scrap pile. And then I can just keep cutting at 1.5 strips, sorry, 1.5 inches. Now I live in Australia. Australia uses metric centimetres and metres more usually, but when you're patchworking, it's much easier to use inches because a lot of the cutting tools come in inches and the patterns are written for inches as well. I finished all the cutting of them, and you know that there are 6. So I'm going to put them together now in combinations of 6 strips. And when you sew strips like this, you could keep going forever, but by working them in blocks, it tends to give them more structure and stability. If you have really long strips, you get everything stretching. But if I can put them into blocks of 6 by 6, then I have the block all holding itself together, and that gives more structure. So that's why I'm choosing to do it this way. Now, because I've done it randomly, I don't have a lot of control about where the designs fall. So I'm doing my best not to get any together, but inevitably I think I will have some that do fall together. When I go to stitch them together, I have to match the corners of each of these seams. And if you were quite pedantic when you were doing the sewing of the first set of strips and the ironing or the pressing, you could press them all so that they're all the same way. And that means that the seams will nest together. Now, I haven't done that, so a good percentage of mine will match, but there will be some that don't. And I'm actually going to pin each of these 6 joins. So there's a bit of pinning involved. Because it's so busy, it's not going to be very easily seen, but it just gives me a little bit of control to make sure that my corners match, because I like to match corners. So I'm going to go ahead now, and as you can see, I've just put these 6 strips together and the match is kind of good. I'm going to put them in sets of 6, and then I'm going to pin them along those joins, and then I'll run them through the machine. It's important that I use the same seam allowance that I used in the first instance, because the seam allowance, using the same seam allowance will make sure that they end up square at the end. And of course, when you do this project, you could sew it yourself so that you use much larger squares. It takes a lot of time when you use tiny little ones, and you could probably do, you know, squares double or triple this size, and it would be a much quicker project. But I like the challenge of small. First square is complete, and this one here has one more row of stitching to do, and then it needs a good press. So I built these larger squares, and I ended up with 10 of them. So I've got 4 left, and 6 of them ended up being joined together in this larger piece here. And I think it's really pretty. After I had finished it, I was a little bit sort of stuck because the size didn't work really well with the bag idea that I had, but I've thought it through over the last couple of days and I've come up with a solution now. And perhaps if I had planned it to be exactly what I wanted it to be originally, it would have been more straightforward. Just the proportions are a little bit out. But I'm quite excited about the way it's going to turn out. So this is the bag that I'm sort of basing it off. I made this bag a few years ago just out of some cotton drill fabric, and the panel that I've made is about the same width as this bag here. So what I'm going to do is go with the width of this panel, and I'm going to, as this one has been done, seam across the bottom of course, and then sew off the corners. and I'm going to make some handles. I was thinking about what's in my stash, and I remembered I bought this piece the other day. It was a few months ago now probably, and it was just a remnant, and it's a 50 centimeter remnant, but because it's quilt backing cotton, it's wide. I haven't measured it, but it's about 2.5 meters wide probably. So even though it's only 50 centimeters in the depth, it's actually quite a big piece of fabric. And it wasn't expensive. I think I paid 50 cents for it or something like that. So it's a good buy. So I'm going to make this as the back. And I think it actually goes quite well with the patching that I've done, and it brings out these dark blue pieces in it. So this is going to be the back of my bag, and I'm also going to use this fabric to make the handles. And because the proportions of this piece are slightly longer, what I'm going to do is finish it off as the sewn piece at the bottom here, but this piece I'm going to turn over onto the inside, and so the top of the bag is going to have a bit of a decorative piece on the inside as well. And then of course I'm going to stitch the straps in, and so I might actually make their depth a little bit deeper than what's on this bag too. You can see the depth of those is only about 1 inch or so, 2.5 centimeters roughly, and so the straps will be a little bit deeper in the bag, but that makes them stronger too. So I'm going to go and cut and stitch a little bit and then show you what I've come up with. And I think once the main pieces are put together, it should come together fairly quickly. So I'm quite excited about this. So this is Create, Quilt and Make with Kate, and we're continuing our progress in making a patchwork bag using a remnant of backing and handles. So I've cut the back of the bag, and this is the front of the bag, and eventually this will be sewn down the sides here and across the bottom, and the corners sewn off and it turned back inside out. But I feel because this patchwork is made up with a lot of linen pieces, which are quite a loose weave, I feel like these at the back here needs a bit of reinforcing, and I don't want to actually quilt it with quilt batting. But I think what I'm going to do is put another layer of fabric on the back on the inside of this, in the way that this bag here is lined also. But I think I want to actually, I don't want to quilt it, because I think that straight lines on this would actually make the patchwork lines look less straight. So it needs to be maybe a curve, maybe some free motion quilting on a single layer. I'm not sure yet, but I need to reinforce this somehow. So I'm going to think about that, and maybe I'll cut the straps while I'm thinking about it. So I'll come back to you soon with some more information. It's kind of pretty, isn't it? So this is one of my leftover squares that I had already made, and I'm going to use it as a test for some free motion quilting. Okay, so I've set my machine up with my free motion foot on it, and I've turned off my feed dogs. I'm also using a new thread that I haven't used before. It's an Aurifil thread, and it's in a grey. I don't know if it's quite the right grey, but we will see. Apparently if you use grey when you quilt, it disappears in with all the other colours, so we'll see what it looks like. I also did a small test, and to do that I just used a double thickness of fairly thick cotton, and when I did the test on it, you might be able to see it's sort of puckered a little bit, and I don't want it to be like that. So what I did was I undid the basting on this, and then I have put a little bit of glued like fusible wadding in there. The fusible wadding comes on a sheet like this, and it has a fluffy side and a side that has little dots on it, and that's the glue. I haven't actually fused it on with the iron yet, but I did sandwich it in between the calico backing and the patchwork sample that I've done on top, and then I've rebasted the whole lot. What I'm going to do then is free motion quilt it all, and then I'm going to top it off with the iron and fuse that on. So let's see how it goes. So the basting is gone. I've pressed it, so the heat has activated the glue on the wadding, and now I'm just going to trim it. And this is a test. You need lots of tests, of course. And I'm actually going to cut it so that I can put a binding on it, and it can just be a little coaster or a table mat. So it's got a backing on it, it's done on the front, and it just needs a binding now. So, okay, so I'm ready to work on my main work now. What I've done is I have my calico back, I've cut a piece of the fusible webbing to go on the inside, and I have the patchwork piece that I've made on top. I've also thread basted it. If you look here, you can see all the thread basting, and basically they're just big loose stitches that hold it all together. I don't finish them on either end because I want to be able to pull them out at the end, and then I'm going to stitch over it, but it just holds it all together for me. I'm actually going to be wearing quilter's gloves, and you might think that's a bit funny to sew with, but they have sticky dots on the fingers, and it helps when you're holding the fabric and moving it around. It means that your fingers don't get tired. Here comes my cat Lola. She's come to investigate. You're kind of in the way, dear. Off you go, my sweet. Back into, she sits on a cardboard box in my desk. I'm doing a series of line with a circle and then out into a line with a circle the other direction. And Lola Cat is doing cartwheels in her box. Okay, let's have a go. So I'm going to start in the corner. Oh, I forgot, you've got to put the foot down. Otherwise you get a cobble. I think you have to remember too that this is practicing techniques, and I'm making a bag, of course, which will be useful, but it's a bag. It doesn't have to be perfect, and sometimes we're afraid to give new things a go, but if you give it a go and have a practice, then you get better at it, and then when you have something that it really does matter, you've got the skills to do it. Okay, so I finished. Let me pull up the foot so my threads move. And this is the finished product. A bit hard to see, isn't it? Okay. And then on the back, it's easier to see on the back. So that's the quilting that I've done using the free motion quilting. Let me get rid of my machine. So you can see the quilting done via free motion quilting, and really and truly this is about the second or third project, if that. I can think of one I've done. There may have been a sample one that I've done before, so I'm not an experienced free motion quilter, but I remember when I first wanted to have a go at free motion quilting, I was really sort of scared because it moved, and that's why you have a test example. And I remember when I first before I even did it on a test one, I just used some scraps of fabric and bits and pieces, but you really can end up with quite a good result. The good thing about it, using the grey thread, it sort of disappears on the front. You can't see it very much, so if you make any mistakes, nobody really knows. And it took about 20 minutes to do that. So I guess there's more complicated designs that you can do that would take longer, but I like the way that the curvy lines on the machine patched squares means that if you drew straight lines, the patching would show up as being less accurate, but the curves seem to hide that a little bit. What I'm going to do now is go and pull out all my basting, and I should just be able to find the ends of the threads and pull. Okay, so I've made up the fabric for the back now, and again I've sandwiched the blue with the fusible batting on the inside and then a piece of calico. I'm at the end of my spare calico, and so I was a little bit short, so I've actually just patched this bit at the end to make up the difference, and I'm going to stitch obviously all over it with the free motion quilting like I've done on the other side. These seams that I've done here, because my machine is set up for the free motion quilting, I didn't want to have to change the foot, change the thread to be able to sew these, so I've actually just done them by hand with a simple running stitch, which is not terribly strong, but my feeling is that once they're all stitched all over like the other, that's going to hold them together. And this patch calico is going to be on the inside of the bag, at the bottom of the bag, so nobody's going to know that it's even there. So when you're doing your sewing projects, there's no quilt police. You can do it however you like, and that's how I've chosen to do it today. It saves me a trip to the store, uses a potentially wasted product, and it's also a patchwork bag, so a little bit more patchwork on the inside really doesn't make any difference. So I'm going to go ahead now and quilt the back with the free motion quilting. It seems to want to go into this corner, so we're going to go there. Say that's done. Have to lift your presser foot, even though it's a free motion quilt and the feed dogs aren't working, because when you lift it, that releases your thread so you can pull them. The long tacking stitches, you can see a big long one here, are on the back side because I tacked from this side, and it means that on the front there's all these little short tacking stitches that you can see. You can see how the Aurifil grey thread really shows up on this, which I guess means you do need to be a little bit neater. And my free motion quilting is getting easier. It's the sort of thing I've realised today that you shouldn't do when you're tired, because it takes a lot of concentration and planning your next move. But for an attempt today on a fabric where the stitching is much more visible, I'm actually quite happy with the result. And it will make a nice back on the bag. You can see the difference between the quilting on here compared to on there. It's much more visible on the plainer fabric. These are going to be the bag handles. So I've cut a 2-inch strip of fabric to be the length that I considered to be enough. I think I've made a bit much actually. And I've cut 2 of those. I had to miter the joins to join them together. And then what I've done here is I have cut a 1.25 inch strip of the same fusible batting that I put on the inside of these other 2 pieces. And then I laid it down on this one, and I turned the edges of it over just on the edge and pinned it. And then I've turned the edges of this top one over and pinned it on top. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stitch down each side using a navy thread to match this so it disappears. And then I'm going to thread up the Aurifil grey, and I'm going to do some loopy loops as a quilting pattern on top of this as well, so that the handles are sort of quilted too. So it's not perfect by a long way, but it's kind of pretty, isn't it? And realistically, it's a bag handle. So its job is to hold the bag, and it looks pretty too. It doesn't have to be perfect. And look at all that practice. So what I've decided to do is to bind the inside seams and I think the top edges, and just for fun I'm going to bind the end of this as well, I think. So there's going to be some binding. So what I need to do is make some binding. All my binding pieces today are straight lines, and so I could just make binding cut on the straight grain, but I'm actually going to cut it on the bias. So I'm going to show you how to do that. Now this here's a scrap of lawn left over, and I actually went to my local fabric shop yesterday to try and buy some plain white lawn, but they didn't seem to have it, and when I bought this they didn't have it either. And the other alternative was to buy the closest color to white, which was this. And so I thought it's silly to buy it at the shop when I already have some left over from the previous project here at home. So I'm going to use what I've got, and I'm going to cut it on the bias. So let me just get my cutting mat organized. it's really handy to have these quilting rulers available. Even if you don't patchwork, they're generally used for patchworking rather than sewing generally. But I find them incredibly useful for all sorts of things. Now I have to work out a straight edge. Now on this fabric here I've got a selvage, which is here. So this is my selvage, and when you cut bias binding or bias tape, it needs to be accurately on the grain or it doesn't behave in the way that you would like it to do. And I'm actually going to piece some together today. Now, on my cutting ruler, there's a 45-degree angle here, and I'm going to use that. I'm going to line the angle up with my quilting edge, so with my fabric edge, and then I'm going to cut across the fabric using the edge of the ruler, because that's at 45 degrees to the 45-degree line on the ruler. Does that make sense? Probably not. All right, I'm going to end up, because this isn't terribly long, I'm going to end up with some short pieces here, but I'm actually happy today. I wanted to cut most of this into bias binding and save it for future projects, so I'm going to go with that today and join them together, and then I'll have a few extra pieces on hand for other projects in the future. Now, I don't know if you can see, but the 45-degree line on my ruler is lining up with my selvage. Normally I would do my cutting like this on my kitchen bench where there's a lot bigger surface area, but today I'm doing it here on my small workbench or my work desk. And because that's lined up to the edge, this angle here that I'm cutting on is 45 degrees. So let me just cut that. I'm going to cut it to 1.5 inches. So I'm cutting 1.5. Now, because the line I've cut here already is on the 45-degree bias, if I just cut another strip, that will be, excuse me, the 1.5. It doesn't quite reach the corner here, and I don't want to move it. It would help if I actually cut straight. Something to be said for cutting on your kitchen bench. It's for when we sew them together, we have to sew them at 90 degrees to each other. Just getting rid of this selvage. So I'm going to turn them like this. And then I will sew across that diagonal, which means that when it opens, it will make a nice long line. Now it obviously needs to be pressed, and at these junctions here I'm going to trim them back, and when I press them open, I'll do this one with finger pressing to start with. The reason lawn is used is it's lovely and flexible, but it's also very lightweight, and so it goes on as a binding without adding much bulk to a seam. When I turn it, you can see it has these little corner tags, so I'm going to cut those off as well. And then I'm going to fold it. So I've stitched these together down the sides and across the bottom. And in the past, what I would have done is just zigzagged it, but I'm working really hard on improving the finishes of the inside of the things that I'm making, so both clothing and craft. What I'm going to do is actually bind the seam. So I'm going to use some of this lawn binding that I've made to put over this seam edge to make it really neat. I'm going to bind the sides and across the bottom. The other thing I'm going to do is cut out a square here on the corner so that I can box off the corners, and the size that I'm going to cut is from the edge, not the seam or stitching line. It's going to be a 2-inch square. So I'm going to draw that in there, cut them out, and then I'm just going to box those off, and I'm going to bind that piece as well. And then I can turn it through and turn over the edges, bind it, and start stitching on the straps, and then we're done. It's really quick. So it took a lot of time to do the patching. It was about a day's work there. And then the quilting took a little bit of time, but now it's all sort of coming together. It'll happen really fast. You can see I've bound this seam, and the same on this one, and also the bottom one. So what I'm going to do now is pull these out and push this together And then I'm going to sew across here, and then I'm going to bind that seam, and then I'm going to do the same on the other corner, and that makes the boxy shape at the bottom of the bag. All the seams are bound now, the side seams, the bottom seam, this side seam. I cut the corners, squared them off, and I've bound those too. We're going to turn it around the right way now, inside out. I've been working really hard with my clothing garments I've been making, or clothing items, and all my craft items recently to take more care with the finish of on the inside. And it actually makes me happy. When I look at a garment or a craft item that I've made and it looks nice and clean and tidy like these ones do, it just builds an extra sense of pride in what you've made. And that's the difference between buying boutique clothing and off the rack garments. This is, it's nicer. Now here's my bag, obviously. It's a bit tall, so we have to fold the edges over. And then we have to work out how to put the straps on. So, as I said before, these are the straps I've made. I've actually cut them in half now. I'm going to attach them, I haven't decided, maybe on the outside, maybe on the inside. If I put them on the outside, I can stitch on the handle and you won't see the stitching. If I put them on the inside, you're going to see the stitching. So maybe the outside's nicer. The top edge is bound, and now I can turn it in, and because the bag has been boxed on the side, it brought the sides in a little, so rather than turning down 2, I think I'm going to turn down 1, 2, 3, 4 of them. So I'm just going to turn that inside, and I think I am going to put them on the outside, and I'll do some nice stitches, maybe even hand stitch. So to put the straps on, I have counted 1, 2.5 squares and 1.5 down, and I've fixed that as my point, and the same on the other side. And then on this side, I measured that, that's 4 centimeters from the edge to the bottom. And so I've put this in 4 centimeters to the bottom, and this pin here marks the top edge. And then I've lined them up with the straps on the other side. Technically, I might have to check that actually. And looking at them, I was going to stitch them by machine, but there's 6, 9, 11, 12 thicknesses of fabric under this end point here. So I think it would be safer to stitch by hand. I think it will break my machine needle. So I'm going to stitch them on by hand, and then my bag is finished.